Hey, what's going on? This is Dylan with Dylan Talks Tone, and today we're going to talk about nuts. How about that? Real quick, this video is sponsored by Audible. I like to read books. I don't have time to read books because I'm working, so a lot of times I'll just have some earbuds, pop them in, and I'll be working on guitars, listening to an audiobook. I really feel like reading, or at least taking that information in from a book, is still a super powerful way to learn. I know that most of us watch tons of YouTube, but reading is still reading, and taking information in that way is still amazing, and so I'm doing it. I'm actually reading two books, probably the same books I was reading in the last video. Black Elk Speaks, it's about Native American stuff. The Tim Ferriss book. Actually, I'm almost done with the Tim Ferriss book. The Black Elk Speaks book is really long. You can go to the link in the description of this video below, and you can get a free book. Keep learning. That's what we do. All right, let's talk about nuts. So first of all, we're going to talk about what the job of it is in an electric guitar, okay? And we're going to say specifically electric guitar because everything applies differently in an acoustic. So we deal mostly with electric guitars here, so we're going to go specifically to that. When we pluck the string, when it's open, like this, we start a transverse wave, which is basically like, you know, like that break dancing, you know what I mean? That's a transverse wave, okay? So wherever we originate that with our finger or our pick, it starts there and it shoots back and forth on the string. The nut and the saddle keep that energy right here. And a very small percentage of that energy will make it through to the tuning post, and then obviously through to the neck. But we're talking a very, very, very small percentage of that energy is going to make it through that nut if the nut is good, right? So that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to keep energy here. And we got another boat. It's the downside of living on a lake, trying to make videos. That's the only downside to living on a lake, by the way. Okay. So, nut material is a big deal. I will tell you right now, if you're watching this video and you expect me to take the guitar apart 5 times for 5 different materials, set up the guitar, and cut 5 different nuts for sound samples, you are poorly mistaken. I am not going to do that. So if you came here for a sound sample, I understand, but I'm not going to do it. It's not possible, reasonably possible. Here's the thing though. Most of the time it doesn't matter, because as much as everybody wants to argue about it, when you fret a note, the nut is basically a non-issue. As long as it's set up correctly, the nut is a non-issue. It has nothing to do with the tone anymore, only from the fret to the saddle at that point. So we're really only talking about applying to open strings. So what I will tell you is, if you feel like your strings are even, they sound even, if you feel like the volume is good, if you feel like the notes are crisp, you're not getting any buzzes or any other loss of energy. Remember, we're trying to keep everything right here because a buzz is a loss of energy. Any kind of fret buzz or nut buzz or saddle rattles, anything, any kind of rattle that is not a note is the loss of energy, and it's taken away from our tone. Okay, and the majority of this talk is all about sustain when it comes to this, but there will be a little bit of tone talk here when we get towards the end. The long and the short of it is, if your nut is set up correctly, it's cut correctly, and everything sounds good, then it is good. The first material, and the reason I say that is because the first material we're going to talk about is plastic. A lot of people want to like look down on a plastic nut. They want to rip it out of their guitar right away, and they just discount it because it comes in cheap guitars, right? So basswood is cheap, plastic nuts are cheap, right? Like, we hear that, but we've heard that before. It's not totally true though. What makes a nut work is the density of it and how solid it is and how resistive it is to wearing out. If the plastic is dense and it's set up correctly and it's not wearing out, there's nothing wrong with it. The problem is that usually very cheap guitars are a cheap ABS injection molded plastic, And sometimes the nut is not even solid. Like if you pull it out of the guitar, it's like hollow on the inside, right? We don't want that. We want a solid, dense piece of plastic. For example, a 1958 to 1960 Les Paul Burst that goes for $300,000 now was a dense plastic. If you drop it on the ground, you could tell it was dense plastic. It wasn't like a cheap ABS, but it still was plastic. In fact, a lot of Gibson guitars, early 335s, had nylon saddles, right? There's nothing wrong with it. As long as it's dense, it's not worn out, and the energy is staying where you want it, it's fine. But if you have a very cheap guitar, like I said, and the nut is not performing well, then you might want to replace it. But don't do it until you really have to. You might have to sooner than you think, because plastic, especially cheap plastic, will wear quickly as the string saws back and forth. As we bend on it, as we play it, as we tune it, that string is sawing back and forth the whole time. And a lot of times you can wear out a plastic nut pretty quickly. Long and the short of it, if your guitar sounds okay, don't worry about it. If it stays in tune, if it plays good, there's no buzzes, don't worry about it. Second, we're going to talk about fancy plastic, like Tusk, for example. I use Tusk nuts in all my guitars. In all of our custom builds, I don't use bone anymore, and we're going to talk about why in a minute. Tusk is a very hard, but very easy to work with material. I really like it because it more or less self-lubricates. Strings slide in there very well, so if you want to use, for example, a tremolo or a Bigsby or something like that, Tusk works really well. Works better than bone in my opinion. They're easier to cut. And what's very interesting about Tusk is that it is, since it's a plastic and it's solid all the way through, it's very consistent all the way through, and we're going to talk about why that's important when we get to bone. The next one is graphite. So graphite is what it sounds like. The cool part about graphite is that it is the coolest thing if you have a tremolo. Not a Floyd Rose, obviously, but if you have some sort of Bigsby, if you have a Strat trem, any kind of 2-point trem or six screw trem, anytime that string's got to move back and forth in there, graphite's killer. However, don't just go buy a bunch of stock of graphite off of eBay and make nuts out of it, because not all graphite is created equal. You got to make sure it's all about the nut stuff is all about density. And go in the comments and make all the jokes you want. It's fine. Keep it kind of like PG-13 though. But we're talking about nuts, so you know the density of it is what's important. So like Graphtec, for example, makes a really good, really consistent product that wears long, and it's still hard enough to sound good. So here's where we could get almost into like a tone minutia, and people can argue in the comments. Let me know what your feeling is on this, because everybody hears it a little different, right? And we're not going to take that opinion away from anybody. Everybody hears it a little different. Graphite is technically kind of like softer than bone or Tusk. So does that mean it doesn't have as good a tone? Well, theoretically, yes. But if the guitar sounds good, if it's performing well, and if you bought the guitar with a graphite nut in it, chances are the person who built the guitar designed it to go that way and be built. So is it like tuned for tone? If you saw my last video about the PRS stuff, you'll know what I'm talking about. You know, a guitar builder could tune it, right? Like he could choose the materials to go together. We do that a lot. And so don't just discount it if it's not a material that you like. For example, graphite. That actually happened to me when I bought my Breedlove. I bought it straight from Breedlove. They shipped me the guitar, and I was like, it's got a Tusk nut in it. What the heck? This was a long, long time ago before I was really into this stuff, into this material. And she's like, no, don't change it. Because, as we get into our next material, bone, she was telling me, she's like, look at bone under a microscope. And I got to thinking about it. I'm like, bone is a sponge. When you buy bulk material for making nuts, it's typically cow femurs. That's what I have had experience with. The reason you ever see, like at StewMac or anywhere else where it says bleached bone nut blanks, the reason they bleach it is probably for sanitation of some sort. However, the real reason I think they bleach it is to get all the color out of it, because the color is not always even in bone. And where that color is uneven in density. Bone is a sponge, and so from one end to a saddle to the other, like in an acoustic guitar, or one end to the nut, one end of the nut to the other, could not be 100% dense all the way through, like 100% consistent from one end to the other. That is one of the main reasons why I don't use bone, because we used to buy like bulk. I used to have to buy like a handful of it like this, you know, nut blanks, and I would literally throw a third of it away, because I'd go through it and I'd start looking, and you could feel it and you could look at it and you could see where there was like rough spots and smooth spots. Even if you sanded it on like a 600 grit sandpaper and then look at it, you could see like little pits in it where it was not dense all the way through. That being said, also, I mean, I'm not like an environmental freak or anything. My motorhome only gets 7 miles to the gallon, but I try to do my part, and so I also don't use animal products in my guitars either, so where I can help it. So we went ahead and went with Tusk, and I have not had one customer say anything about it. If the nut is, again, if the nut is set up and it is done correctly, don't worry about it. The next material we're going to talk about is brass. Brass nuts are cool. They've actually, I think in the 80s probably, wouldn't you say? If you remember these, like in some kind of like shreddy guitars and stuff, they put a brass nut in there. And here's another one where the tone can really be affected by brass. Brass is, it's so hard that you can definitely, when you strum an open chord, you can definitely hear a difference between it and Tusk or Bone. Tusk and Bone, you can't tell the difference really. Some people are, you can obviously argue about it in the comments if you want, but if I did a blind test with you, I bet you wouldn't be able to tell the difference. But brass, you can really tell. I mean, brass is super, super dense. The downside to it is, it sounds crazy, it wears. And that's not good, because it's really hard to cut. I used it in a couple of custom guitars probably 5 years ago or so, and man, was it a pain. It was really neat and it sounded cool. It was actually on a semi-hollow aluminum top guitar, so I couldn't really give you a reference to say, hey, go watch this video, because it didn't really apply to what we're talking about here because it was so crazy. But it's such a hard material that it does give you a kind of a different tone. So what are we saying with all 5 of these materials for nuts? Nothing really. Don't worry about it. If your guitar has whatever it has in it, play it until you wear it out. If you want to experiment with stuff after that, do it based on the function of the guitar. So if you have a tremolo on your guitar and you have a plastic nut in it, let's say it's a Squier Fender, for example. Although a lot of the Squiers have bone in them now. So let's say it's whatever guitar, doesn't matter. Let's say it's a cheap Strat knockoff, for example, and it has a bone, a plastic nut, and it has a tremolo. Don't stress about it tone-wise. You're gonna put a bunch of work and money into something that you may not even hear a difference. Maybe you will, maybe you won't. But what you're concerned about is functionality. You're going to wear that nut out and then buy the next nut that you replace in that guitar based on the function. Say, everybody on the internet says to buy bone. However, I have a tremolo and I'm having a hard enough time keeping the thing in tune. I think I'd rather go with Tusk or Graphite. And don't stress about the tiny, 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 tiny little differences in tone that possibly could be there between materials. Go based on function. That's really why this stuff comes out. If you want bone, get bone, but I don't like it. I just don't like it. But base your decision on the function of the guitar and what you're trying to get out of it. Don't base it on the tone. I'm just going to say it like that. I'm just going to be really straight with you. Don't base it on the tone. And I know that there's a lot of super traditional dudes out there and dudettes that are saying, bone, 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 bone. Okay, I mean, use it if you want. That's fine. I'm not going to. We're going to stick with Tusk. If you have any questions about nuts, put them in the comments and let's talk about it. I want to know what you're using. And if you've actually tried stuff, you know, a lot of people will talk in the comments and they will have never actually tried something when they've really been put to it. So if you have tried this stuff, let me know what you think and let me know what you've heard on your guitar, because this is one of those really subjective things. I guess the whole point of this entire comparison side of this breakdown of this video is it's about the function of it, not so much the material. The material can lead to that function based on friction, but everything in a guitar is friction, baby. So that's what you got to worry about. My name is Dylan. This has been Dylan Talks Tone. Check us out on Thursday on our live show. Check us out on Patreon. Since we bought a whole guitar for the PRS test, we don't need to buy PRS pickups anymore. So I'm going to use the Patreon money to buy some active pickups, because I want to do some stuff with active pickups. I think it'd be kind of fun. And I got a Floyd Rose video coming up. I got some more Telly stuff coming up. We got a lot of fun stuff going. And I'm going to sell this guitar, so if you're interested, get in the comments and let me know. Thanks for hanging out. My name is Dylan. This has been Dylan Talks Tone. We'll see you next time.